We are living through one of the most consequential and dangerous periods in modern American history, a moment that will be studied for generations as the inflection point where the United States of America abandoned the pretense of international law and embraced naked imperial conquest as official state policy. The first 23 days of 2026 have been nothing short of apocalyptic for the global order that has governed international relations since the end of World War II. What we are witnessing is not merely a shift in American foreign policy or a temporary aberration in diplomatic norms, but rather a fundamental restructuring of how power operates on the global stage, a return to the law of the jungle, where might makes right, and the strong do what they will, while the weak suffer what they must. This is not hyperbole. This is not alarmist rhetoric designed to generate clicks or views. This is the sober assessment of what Donald Trump has unleashed in his second term as President of the United States, and the implications are staggering for every nation on Earth, every alliance structure, every international institution, and every citizen who believed that humanity had progressed beyond the age of empires and colonialism. The speed and ferocity with which Trump has moved to dismantle the architecture of American-led globalism is breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. We are not talking about subtle policy adjustments or gradual realignments of strategic priorities. We are talking about a full-throated embrace of imperialism that would make Theodore Roosevelt blush, a foreign policy doctrine so aggressive and unilateral that it makes the Bush Doctrine look like pacifism by comparison. Trump has declared, in no uncertain terms, that the Western Hemisphere belongs to America and that he will tolerate no interference from any foreign power in what he considers to be his sphere of influence. This is not the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which warned European powers against colonizing the Americas, while America itself was too weak to enforce such a proclamation. This is something far more dangerous and far more ambitious. This is the Don-Reo Doctrine, named after Donald Trump himself, a declaration of absolute American hegemony over 1/3 of the world's landmass and nearly half of the globe when you include the surrounding oceans. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced this new doctrine to a stunned international audience, but few people truly understood what it meant at the time. They do now. The Don-Reo Doctrine is not a defensive posture. It is not about protecting American interests or deterring aggression. It is about conquest, pure and simple. It is about establishing American dominance through force, intimidation, and the ruthless application of economic and military pressure. And Trump is not hiding his intentions. Unlike previous American presidents who felt compelled to cloak their imperial ambitions in the language of democracy promotion, humanitarian intervention, or the defense of freedom, Trump speaks with brutal honesty about what he wants and why he wants it. When previous administrations invaded Iraq, they insisted it was about weapons of mass destruction or bringing democracy to the Middle East, even as critics pointed out that oil was the real motivator. Trump dispenses with such pretenses entirely. He wants Venezuela's oil, so he is taking Venezuela's oil. He wants Greenland's strategic location and mineral wealth, so he is taking Greenland. He sees an opportunity to consolidate American power in the Western Hemisphere, so he is seizing that opportunity without regard for international law, diplomatic norms, or the sovereignty of other nations. This is what makes Trump so uniquely dangerous. Not that he is doing things that other American presidents have not done or wanted to do, but that he is doing them openly, proudly, and without any of the shame or restraint that characterized previous eras of American foreign policy. The kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro represents the most shocking violation of international law since the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. Let that sink in for a moment. The President of the United States ordered American special forces to enter the sovereign territory of Venezuela, break into the presidential residence in the middle of the night, and abduct the democratically elected head of state and his wife from their bedroom while they were in their pajamas. Maduro and his wife were then flown to New York on a military aircraft, paraded before cameras like captured criminals, and subjected to what can only be described as a show trial designed to humiliate a foreign leader and send a message to every government on earth that opposes American interests. This was not a covert operation that the administration tried to hide or deny. This was not an extra-legal rendition of a terrorist suspect or a drug lord. This was the forcible removal of a sitting president from his own country, carried out in broad daylight, announced on television, and celebrated by American officials as a triumph of American power. There was no United Nations Security Council resolution authorizing this action. There was no declaration of war by Congress. There was not even an attempt to manufacture a legal justification for what amounts to an act of piracy and kidnapping on a scale unprecedented in modern international relations. The European response to the Maduro kidnapping was nothing short of pathetic. One would think that the forcible overthrow of a government by a foreign power, regardless of one's opinion of that government, would trigger immediate condemnation from nations that claim to uphold international law and the sovereignty of states. One would expect emergency sessions of the United Nations, fiery speeches from European leaders, and at minimum a strongly worded statement of protest. Instead, what we got was silence, mumbling, and in some cases, tacit support for what Trump had done. European leaders who spent years lecturing the world about the importance of international institutions and the rule of law suddenly found themselves unable to articulate a coherent response when the United States trampled those very principles into the dirt. They offered vague statements about monitoring the situation, called for all parties to respect democratic processes, and then quickly moved on to other topics, as if the kidnapping of a head of state was just another news cycle to be managed. This deafening silence from Europe was not an accident. It was a calculated decision based on fear, weakness, and the recognition that Europe is completely dependent on American military power and has no ability to challenge Washington even when American actions violate everything Europe claims to stand for. Trump's justification for the Venezuelan operation is as brazen as the operation itself. He wants Venezuela's oil, and he is not pretending otherwise. In his own words, Trump has stated that Venezuela's petroleum reserves now belong to the United States, that America will manage these resources for the benefit of both the Venezuelan people and the American people, but primarily for the benefit of American energy security and American corporate interests. The first thing Trump did after installing his puppet government in Caracas was to seize Venezuelan oil tankers in international waters and redirect their cargo to American ports. He then sent a message to his hand-picked Venezuelan authorities demanding that they immediately begin shipping 3 to 5 million barrels of oil to the United States, and they complied without protest because they understand that their position depends entirely on American military support. In a particularly revealing comment, Trump compared his protection of Venezuela to a mafia protection racket, stating that Venezuela no longer needs to spend money on its own defense because America is now protecting it. And in exchange for this protection, Venezuela will hand over its oil. This is the language of a gangster, not a statesman, and yet it is being deployed by the President of the United States as official policy. The economic warfare that has accompanied the military operation is equally devastating. Since January 3rd, not a single tanker of Venezuelan oil has reached China or any other country outside the American sphere of control. The flow of petroleum from Venezuela to its traditional customers has been completely severed, enforced by American naval power and the threat of secondary sanctions against any company or country that dares to buy Venezuelan oil without American approval. The Chinese government is reportedly furious but paralyzed, unable to protect its commercial interests against American military might, and unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with the United States over access to Venezuelan resources. This is what American dominance looks like in practice: the ability to unilaterally cut off a major oil-producing nation from global markets and redirect that production to serve American interests, all without any meaningful opposition from other great powers or international institutions. But Venezuela is just the beginning. Trump has also ordered airstrikes against Nigeria, bombed Syrian territory, and most ominously, announced his intention to destroy Iran. The buildup of American military assets in the Persian Gulf and surrounding regions has been rapid and massive, with troops, aircraft carriers, and weapons systems pouring into the Middle East at a pace not seen since the buildup to the Iraq War in 2003. The parallels to Venezuela are unmistakable. Just as Trump began by threatening Venezuela, then applying economic pressure, then ultimately ordering a military operation to seize control of the country, he is now following the same playbook with Iran. The difference is that Iran is a much larger country with a more capable military and a history of asymmetric warfare against American forces in the region. A full-scale war with Iran would be catastrophic, potentially drawing in regional powers, disrupting global energy markets, and killing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And yet Trump seems utterly unconcerned about these risks, treating the prospect of war with Iran the same way he treats his business negotiations, as a transaction where superior force can be leveraged to extract concessions and achieve desired outcomes. The situation in Syria remains chaotic and unclear, with multiple powers operating on Syrian soil and no coherent legal framework governing any of their actions. Trump has bombed Syrian government positions, supported various rebel factions, and maintained an illegal occupation of Syrian oil fields, all without a declaration of war or authorization from Congress. The American presence in Syria exists in a legal gray zone that previous administrations at least pretended to be uncomfortable with, offering convoluted justifications about fighting terrorism or protecting Kurdish allies. Trump offers no such justifications. American forces are in Syria because Trump wants them there, and they will stay as long as he finds it useful, and that is the extent of his reasoning on the matter. International law is not a consideration. Syrian sovereignty is not a consideration. The opinions of allies or the United Nations are not considerations. There is only the will of Donald Trump and the capacity of American military power to enforce that will. And then there is Greenland, perhaps the most audacious and revealing of all Trump's imperial projects. Trump has openly declared his intention to acquire Greenland from Denmark, stating that he will pursue this goal through peaceful means if possible, but through military force if necessary, and that regardless of the method, Greenland will become American territory. This is not a negotiation. This is an ultimatum. Denmark, a NATO ally of the United States, suddenly found itself in the position of being threatened with military conquest by the nation that is supposed to be its protector and partner. The initial response from Copenhagen was defiant, with Danish leaders asserting that Greenland is not for sale and that Danish sovereignty over the island is non-negotiable. Trump's response was swift and brutal. He threatened Denmark and 7 other European NATO members with additional tariffs of 10% on all their exports to the United States, and he made clear that if this issue is not resolved by June, those tariffs will increase to 25%, a level that would absolutely devastate the export-dependent economies of Northern Europe. The strategic importance of Greenland cannot be overstated. The island sits at the intersection of the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean, controlling access routes that are becoming increasingly important as climate change opens up new shipping lanes and makes Arctic resources more accessible. Greenland possesses vast deposits of rare earth minerals that are essential for advanced electronics, military systems, and green energy technologies, resources that America currently depends on China to provide. The island also hosts critical early warning radar systems and offers potential locations for missile defense installations that could intercept Russian or Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles. From a military perspective, whoever controls Greenland controls the Guyuk Gap, the maritime choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom that Russian submarines must pass through to reach the Atlantic Ocean. In short, Greenland is one of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on the planet, and Trump wants it because he understands that controlling Greenland would give America an insurmountable advantage in any future conflict with Russia or China. The European response to the Greenland crisis has been one of utter capitulation. After Trump's tariff threats, European leaders scrambled to find a compromise that would satisfy American demands without completely surrendering Danish sovereignty. The solution they arrived at is reminiscent of the arrangements that carved up Cyprus, with proposals to give the United States permanent sovereign military bases on Greenland that would be under exclusive American control in perpetuity. Trump seems poised to accept this arrangement, which would give him the strategic benefits he wants without the political complications of a formal annexation. When reporters asked Trump how long America would control these bases, his response was revealing and chilling. He said forever, and he said it with the glee of a child who has just been given exactly what he wanted for Christmas. Trump is not bound by the normal constraints of political rhetoric or diplomatic language. He says what he means and means what he says, and what he means is that American control over Greenland will be permanent and irreversible. The NATO alliance is experiencing what can only be described as a slow-motion collapse. Trump has effectively neutralized the alliance from within, transforming what was once the most powerful military coalition in history into a protection racket where European members pay tribute to Washington in exchange for security guarantees that may or may not be honored depending on Trump's mood at any given moment. The fundamental premise of NATO, enshrined in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, is that an attack on one member is an attack on all members and will trigger a collective defense response. But what happens when the threat comes not from Russia or China, but from the United States itself? What happens when the largest and most powerful member of the alliance starts threatening other members with economic warfare and territorial annexation? The answer is that NATO becomes meaningless, a hollow shell that exists on paper but has no real substance or credibility. European leaders understand this, which is why their public statements have become increasingly desperate and obsequious. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has debased himself repeatedly in attempts to placate Trump. Last year, Rutte told Trump that NATO members see him as a father figure, someone who has the right to scold and discipline his children as he sees fit. The implication was clear. Europe sees itself as subordinate to America, not as an equal partner in a defensive alliance. Trump loved this framing and responded positively to Rutte's flattery, but the fundamental problem remains that NATO cannot function as a mutual defense pact when one member treats the others as vassals to be commanded rather than allies to be consulted. Rutte's pathetic attempts at flattery may have bought NATO a temporary reprieve, but they also revealed the profound power imbalance at the heart of the alliance and the willingness of European leaders to humiliate themselves in order to maintain access to American protection. French President Emmanuel Macron has been equally shameless in his efforts to curry favor with Trump. Leaked messages, which Trump himself made public, show Macron attempting to redirect Trump's attention away from Greenland by offering him a bigger prize, suggesting that Trump should focus on Iran instead, because there are opportunities for grand strategic moves in the Middle East that would dwarf anything he could achieve in the Arctic. Macron's message, which was not denied by the French government, reads like something an adult would write to distract a petulant child, offering shiny new toys to make the child forget about whatever he was previously focused on. Macron suggested that he and Trump could work together on Iran, on Syria, that they could organize a G7 summit, and that they should have a nice dinner in Paris to discuss all these wonderful possibilities. The tone is manipulative and condescending, and yet Macron felt compelled to write it because he understands that traditional diplomatic engagement does not work with Trump. Trump cannot be reasoned with or persuaded through logical argument. He can only be managed through flattery, ego-stroking, and the constant reinforcement of his self-image as the most powerful man in the world. What makes Trump's behavior even more disturbing is that he seems to derive genuine pleasure from humiliating other world leaders. He publicly released Macron's private messages specifically to embarrass the French president and to show the world that even leaders of major powers are reduced to groveling before him. Trump has done the same with messages from Rutte, sharing screenshots of the NATO Secretary General's obsequious promises to praise Trump in every public appearance and to tell journalists what a great leader Trump is. These are supposed to be confidential diplomatic communications, the kind of messages that would normally remain secret for 50 or 100 years until they are released by archives for historical research. Trump treats them as content for his social media feed, as proof of his dominance, as trophies to be displayed. This is not how a responsible leader of a democratic nation behaves. This is how an autocrat behaves. Someone who sees diplomacy as a zero-sum game, where the goal is not to find mutually beneficial solutions, but to demonstrate superior power and extract maximum humiliation from anyone who dares to oppose or even question his decisions. Before the Davos summit, Trump delivered a series of profanity-laced tirades where he openly mocked foreign leaders, describing in vulgar terms how they all come to him begging for favors, how they debase themselves in his presence, and how he enjoys watching them grovel. The specific language Trump used is so crude that it defies translation into polite discourse, but the message was unmistakable. Trump sees himself as operating above the normal rules of international relations, and he views other leaders not as counterparts or partners, but as supplicants whose job is to flatter him and comply with his demands. And here is the truly terrifying part. He is not entirely wrong. Leaders of major democracies are indeed flattering him, begging for his attention, and compromising their stated principles in order to stay in his good graces. Trump's assessment of the situation may be crude and narcissistic, but it is not inaccurate. He has correctly identified that Europe is too weak and too dependent on American power to effectively resist his demands, and he is exploiting that weakness with ruthless efficiency. The Davos summit itself was a spectacle of American dominance and European submission. Trump arrived in Switzerland in a state of manic excitement, treating the gathering of global elites as his personal stage. Every day of the summit, Trump attacked a different country or leader, mocked their policies, threatened them with economic retaliation, and made outrageous statements that would have ended the career of any previous president. And yet, the assembled leaders did nothing. They smiled nervously, they tried to change the subject, they offered carefully worded responses that avoided direct confrontation, and they hoped that Trump would lose interest and move on to someone else. Rutte promised before the summit that he would spend his time at Davos praising Trump to journalists, and he kept that promise, telling reporters that Trump is a wonderful leader who is doing great things for the world. This is the NATO Secretary General, the man who is supposed to represent the collective interests of 30 member states, acting as Trump's public relations agent because he believes that is the only way to keep the alliance alive. In Trump's second term, he is surrounded by people who are either more extreme than he is or too afraid of him to offer any meaningful pushback. In his first term, there were still responsible adults in positions of authority, cabinet secretaries and military officers who would quietly work to moderate Trump's worst impulses, slow walk his most dangerous orders, and filter his statements through the normal channels of government bureaucracy. Those people are gone. They have been purged, forced out, or resigned in protest. The current administration is staffed by loyalists, true believers, and opportunists who owe their positions entirely to Trump and understand that their continued employment depends on never contradicting him. Trump's Secretary of Defense, for example, is a former television commentator with no military experience or national security background, someone Trump picked because he liked how the man looked on camera and appreciated his willingness to advocate for aggressive military action without qualification or hesitation. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is a true believer in American exceptionalism, who, if left to his own devices, would probably have invaded Cuba already, and is now channeling his interventionist impulses into support for Trump's broader agenda of hemispheric dominance. Imagine if a leader like Trump had come to power in Germany or France, countries with significant military capabilities but nothing approaching American power. The world would be alarmed but ultimately able to contain the damage through collective action. But Trump is not the leader of Germany or France. He is the President of the United States, the country with the most powerful military on earth, the largest economy, the reserve currency, the most advanced weapon systems, and a nuclear arsenal capable of destroying human civilization. When a leader with Trump's temperament and ideology controls that much power, the danger to the entire world is almost incalculable. And make no mistake, the next 3 years are going to be extraordinarily difficult and dangerous, not just for America, but for every nation on earth. Trump is not engaging in political theater for domestic consumption. He is creating real crises, provoking real conflicts, and dismantling real institutions that have maintained some semblance of international order for the past 80 years. The crises are accelerating. What was once shocking becomes normalized within days. The kidnapping of Maduro, which should have been the defining scandal of Trump's presidency, was quickly overshadowed by the Greenland crisis, which in turn is being overshadowed by the buildup toward war with Iran. Tomorrow, Trump could announce that he wants Scotland, that he is claiming a Canadian province, that he has decided Alaska should have been payment for something, and now he wants additional territory to compensate for perceived historical injustices. Nothing is off the table. No demand is too absurd. No action is too extreme. We are living in a world where every morning brings a new crisis, where the President of the United States operates without any institutional constraints, and where the normal guardrails of democratic governance and international law have been completely swept away. And here is the crucial point that many observers are still failing to grasp. This is not a temporary aberration that will end when Trump leaves office. America has been permanently changed by Trump's presidency. The institutions that were hollowed out will not simply spring back to life. The norms that were violated will not automatically be restored. The precedents that have been set, the kidnapping of foreign leaders, the annexation of allied territory, the withdrawal from international organizations, the open embrace of imperial conquest, these will not be erased by the next administration. Even if Trump's successor wants to return to the old order, wants to rebuild alliances and recommit to international law, that person will find that the old order no longer exists to return to. Trump has smashed the architecture of American-led globalism like a bull in a china shop, and no amount of careful reconstruction will fully restore what has been lost. The world is changing in response to America's transformation, and that process is irreversible. Other countries are adjusting their strategies to account for the new reality of American power, unconstrained by any institutional or normative limits. Allies are hedging, adversaries are probing for weaknesses, and everyone is preparing for a future that looks radically different from the past. Europe is frantically attempting to build up its own defense capabilities because European leaders now understand that they cannot rely on American protection, that NATO is functionally dead, even if it still exists on paper, and that they need to be able to defend themselves against Russia without American help, and possibly even defend themselves against America. If Trump decides that European territory or resources are worth seizing, Canada is reaching out to China, attempting to balance against American pressure by diversifying its partnerships and creating alternative options to economic dependence on the United States. These are rational responses to the threat that Trump represents, but they also mean that the world is fragmenting into competing blocs, that the era of American hegemony is ending not because America is weak, but because America has chosen to weaponize its strength in ways that make it impossible for other countries to trust or cooperate with Washington. Trump is not building a new world order. He is destroying the old one without any plan for what comes next. He is tearing down international institutions, shredding treaties, abandoning allies, and promoting a vision of international relations based purely on the exercise of raw power. The World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, NATO, all of these were American creations, institutions designed to serve American interests while providing enough benefits to other countries that they would willingly participate in an American-led system. Trump sees these institutions as constraints on American power rather than force multipliers, and he is systematically withdrawing from them, defunding them, or working to destroy them from within. The chaos that Trump is creating is not confined to foreign policy. The same dynamics are playing out domestically, with American institutions being hollowed out, dismantled, or captured by loyalists who are more interested in serving Trump than in upholding the Constitution or serving the public interest. We are seeing unprecedented scenes in American cities where immigration enforcement officers operate in masks, armed with weapons, stopping people on the street without probable cause, handcuffing them without checking their identification, throwing them into vehicles, and interrogating them for hours before sometimes discovering that they have just detained an American citizen. There have already been incidents of immigration officers shooting and killing American citizens, claiming that the victim was driving toward them or posed a threat, claims that are contradicted by video evidence showing that the victim was complying with orders and posed no danger whatsoever. This is not normal. This is not acceptable in a democracy governed by the rule of law. But it is happening every day, and the pace is accelerating. Trump has created a climate where federal agents believe they can act with impunity, where constitutional protections are treated as inconvenient suggestions rather than binding law, and where violence against civilians is justified in the name of national security or border protection. Trump began the new year by withdrawing the United States from 66 international organizations, most of them affiliated with the United Nations. The World Health Organization was among the first to go, even though American participation in global health initiatives is essential for monitoring and responding to pandemics that could kill millions of people. Trump does not care. He sees international cooperation as weakness and multilateral institutions as obstacles to American unilateralism. The historical parallel here is chilling. When the League of Nations collapsed in the 1930s because major powers refused to support it, the result was World War II. The League was powerless to prevent aggression by Germany, Italy, and Japan precisely because those countries understood that the League had no enforcement mechanism and no willingness to confront them. The United Nations was created after World War II specifically to avoid repeating that catastrophe, to create a forum where disputes could be resolved peacefully and where collective security could be maintained through international cooperation. But the United Nations only works if the most powerful countries choose to work within its framework. When the United States withdraws from UN institutions and openly defies international law, the UN becomes as irrelevant as the League of Nations was in the 1930s, and we are left with the same power dynamics that produced 2 world wars and countless smaller conflicts throughout human history. Trump believes that rules and institutions limit American power unnecessarily. He looks at American military might, economic dominance, and technological superiority and asks why America should restrain itself when it has the power to simply take what it wants. From Trump's perspective, international law is something you impose on your enemies while exempting yourself. The kidnapping of Maduro, the seizure of Venezuelan oil, the threatened annexation of Greenland, all of these actions violate the UN Charter, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and numerous other treaties that the United States has signed and ratified. Trump is aware of these violations and does not care because he does not believe that America should be bound by the same rules that apply to weaker nations. This is not a defensible position legally or morally, but it is a coherent position strategically if you believe that power is the only thing that matters in international relations. Trump's actions are also destroying NATO, not because he is withdrawing from the alliance, but because he is making it clear that NATO's collective defense commitment is conditional on whether Trump personally likes a particular member country and whether that country has paid sufficient tribute to Washington. During his first term, Trump questioned whether America would defend Montenegro if it were attacked, suggesting that such a small country was not worth American lives. In his second term, he has gone much further, actively threatening NATO members with economic warfare and territorial annexation. When the country that provides the nuclear umbrella and the majority of NATO's military capability starts threatening its own allies, the alliance ceases to have any meaning. Article 5 is supposed to guarantee that all NATO members will come to the defense of any member that is attacked. But what does that guarantee mean when the United States itself might be the aggressor? Europe is waking up to the reality that NATO is already dead in all but name, that American protection can no longer be counted on, and that European countries need to prepare for a future where they are on their own. The European response to this realization is a massive increase in defense spending and a renewed push for strategic autonomy. Germany, which has historically been reluctant to invest in its military due to the legacy of World War II and a political culture that emphasizes pacifism and multilateralism, is now planning defense budgets that could exceed $100 billion within the next few years. France and the United Kingdom are following similar paths, pouring money into weapon systems, expanding their armed forces, and developing capabilities that would allow them to operate independently of the United States. The combined defense spending of the European Union could reach $1 trillion annually as countries scramble to build the military capacity they need to deter Russia without American help. But even with these investments, Europe will not be able to match Russian military power within the next 5 years, which is why European leaders are still trying desperately to keep Trump engaged, to flatter him, to buy time while they prepare for the worst. Europe is also reconsidering its position on Ukraine, not because European leaders have suddenly decided that Ukrainian sovereignty is unimportant, but because they are making cold calculations about what is strategically necessary to survive in a world where America is no longer a reliable partner. The logic is brutal but clear. If Europe can keep Russia bogged down in Ukraine for another 3 to 5 years by making limited territorial concessions and accepting a frozen conflict, then Europe gains the time it needs to rearm and prepare for a potential future conflict with Russia without American support. Ukraine becomes, in this calculus, a buffer zone that absorbs Russian military capacity while Europe builds up its own defenses. This is a cynical and morally questionable position, but it reflects the realpolitik that European leaders are now forced to engage in because Trump has shattered the illusions of collective security and shared values that underpin the transatlantic relationship. Germany is almost certainly going to pursue nuclear weapons. This may not be stated explicitly in the near term, but the logic is inescapable. A Europe that cannot count on the American nuclear umbrella and faces a nuclear-armed Russia has no choice but to develop its own nuclear deterrent. France and the United Kingdom already possess nuclear weapons, but their arsenals are small and their delivery systems are not capable of penetrating Russian missile defenses or surviving a first strike. If Russia launched a full-scale nuclear attack on Europe, the British and French arsenals might be able to retaliate and inflict some damage, but they would not be able to prevent Russia from destroying Europe as a functioning civilization. Only a robust, survivable nuclear deterrent comparable to America's can provide that level of security, and that means Germany needs nuclear weapons. The political and diplomatic obstacles to German nuclearization are enormous, but those obstacles become less significant when the alternative is subjugation or annihilation. Expect to see quiet discussions about nuclear sharing agreements, about European nuclear forces under joint command, and eventually about Germany developing its own independent nuclear capability. The broader point here is that Trump is not just changing American foreign policy. He is forcing every other country to fundamentally rethink its strategic position and adjust to a world where American power cannot be trusted and may in fact be the primary threat to their security and prosperity. This is a massive shift with consequences that will play out over decades. Alliances are fracturing, international institutions are collapsing, and countries are preparing for conflict on a scale not seen since the Cold War. And all of this is happening because one man, Donald Trump, decided that the international order built by his predecessors was an inconvenience that he would rather destroy than maintain. Trump is not the first American president to ignore international law or act unilaterally, but he is the first to do so openly and proudly, to treat violations of sovereignty and acts of aggression not as necessary evils to be justified and minimized, but as triumphs to be celebrated and expanded upon. Previous presidents felt compelled to at least pretend that they cared about international norms, to offer justifications for their actions, to work through the United Nations when possible, and to maintain the fiction that America was acting in defense of universal values rather than naked self-interest. Trump has dispensed with all of that. He is clear about his motivations. He wants resources, he wants territory, he wants other countries to submit to American dominance, and he has the military power to get what he wants. This honesty is in some ways refreshing after decades of American officials lying about their true intentions. But it is also terrifying because it removes any constraint on American behavior and signals to every other country that the era of international law is over and the era of great power competition by any means necessary has begun. The kidnapping of Maduro should have been a line that even Trump would not cross. The forcible removal of a head of state from his own country is an act of war, a violation so extreme that it delegitimizes any claim to moral authority or respect for sovereignty. And yet Trump crossed that line without hesitation, and the world did nothing. Europe issued weak statements of concern. The United Nations held emergency meetings that produced no concrete action. China and Russia condemned the move but took no steps to reverse it or punish the United States. The lesson of the Maduro kidnapping is clear. America can do whatever it wants, and no one will stop it. This is the most dangerous lesson that could possibly be taught because it establishes a precedent that will encourage even more aggressive behavior in the future. If Trump can kidnap a president with impunity, what can he not do? If international law provides no protection for the most basic principle of sovereignty, the right of a nation to be governed by its own leaders without foreign interference, then international law provides no protection for anything. The seizure of Venezuelan oil is similarly brazen. Trump is not even bothering to create a puppet government that maintains the fiction of Venezuelan independence. He is openly stating that Venezuela's oil now belongs to the United States, that America will control Venezuelan production and exports, and that revenues from Venezuelan oil will flow to American companies and the American Treasury. This is colonialism in its purest form, the extraction of resources from a subject territory for the benefit of an imperial power, and it is being done in the 21st century by the United States of America, the country that supposedly led the fight against colonialism in the 20th century and promoted decolonization as a moral imperative. The hypocrisy is staggering, but more importantly, the implications are terrifying. If America can seize Venezuelan oil, it can seize Nigerian oil, Iranian oil, or any other resource it decides it wants. The only question is whether Trump believes the target is weak enough that it can be conquered without unacceptable costs to American forces. Iran is clearly in Trump's crosshairs. The military buildup in the Persian Gulf is unmistakable, and Trump's rhetoric about destroying Iran leaves little doubt about his intentions. The Venezuela operation is serving as a template. Declare that a country is a threat or an opportunity, build up military forces in the region, apply economic pressure through sanctions and blockades, and then launch a military operation to achieve regime change and seize control of strategic resources. Iran is a much tougher target than Venezuela, with a larger population, a more capable military, and allies in the region who might come to its defense. A war with Iran would be catastrophic, destabilizing the entire Middle East, disrupting global oil supplies, and potentially escalating into a broader regional or even global conflict. But Trump does not seem to be deterred by these risks. He sees Iran as an obstacle to American dominance in the Middle East and as a source of oil that America could control if the current government were removed. The cost in human lives and global instability does not factor into his calculations because Trump does not think in those terms. He thinks in terms of winning and losing, dominance and submission, and he believes that America can win any conflict through the application of overwhelming force. The Greenland situation is perhaps the most revealing of Trump's mindset because it demonstrates his willingness to threaten and coerce even close allies. Denmark is not an enemy of the United States. Denmark is a NATO ally, a democracy, a country that has consistently supported American foreign policy objectives and contributed to American-led military operations. And yet Trump is threatening Denmark with economic destruction if it does not surrender Greenland to American control. The tariff threat is not symbolic. A 25% tariff on Danish exports to the United States would be economically devastating, potentially triggering a recession in Denmark and causing political upheaval that could bring down the government. Trump is essentially telling Denmark that it can choose to surrender Greenland peacefully or be crushed economically, and if economic pressure is not sufficient, he is implying that military force remains an option. This is not how allies treat each other. This is how empires treat colonies. The compromise that Europe seems to be offering, giving the United States permanent sovereign bases on Greenland while maintaining nominal Danish sovereignty over the island, is reminiscent of the arrangements that divided Cyprus after the Turkish invasion in 1974. The British sovereign base areas in Cyprus are technically British territory under British law, even though they are located on an island that is otherwise divided between the Republic of Cyprus and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The proposed arrangement for Greenland would follow a similar model, with the United States exercising full sovereignty over designated areas of the island in perpetuity, meaning that those areas would be American territory for all practical purposes, even if Denmark continued to claim sovereignty over Greenland as a whole. Trump seems satisfied with this arrangement because it gives him what he actually wants: control over the strategic locations, the rare earth mineral deposits, and the military facilities, without the political complications of formally annexing the entire island. The fact that Trump said forever when asked how long America would control these bases is significant because it reveals his understanding that this is a permanent transfer of territory, not a temporary arrangement that could be renegotiated in the future. Trump is not thinking about a 99-year lease like the British had in Hong Kong. He is thinking about permanent American sovereignty over parts of Greenland, comparable to how the United States controls Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, except even more extreme because the Cuban government has never accepted the legitimacy of the American presence at Guantanamo and has demanded its return for decades. The Greenland arrangement would presumably have Danish consent, at least formally, which would make it harder to challenge legally and easier to maintain indefinitely. European leaders have utterly failed to stand up to Trump on Greenland, just as they failed to stand up to him on Venezuela. After Trump's tariff threats, European resolve crumbled almost immediately. Leaders who had initially said that Greenland was not for sale and that Danish sovereignty was non-negotiable quickly began looking for ways to give Trump what he wanted while saving face. The NATO Secretary General said that Greenland is not important, that what really matters is Ukraine, which is an absurd statement given that the territory Trump is trying to seize from Denmark is larger than the territory Russia has occupied in Ukraine. How can Europe credibly claim to be defending Ukrainian sovereignty against Russian aggression when it is simultaneously surrendering Greenland to American aggression? The answer is that Europe cannot credibly make that claim, and European leaders know it, but they are prioritizing short-term stability and access to American military protection over long-term principles and the integrity of international law. Once you accept that rules can be broken for powerful countries, those rules cease to exist for anyone. This is true in domestic law and in international law. If one person or one country is allowed to violate the rules with impunity, then the rules are not actually rules but merely suggestions that apply only to the weak. Trump understood this instinctively, which is why he is systematically breaking every norm and violating every principle of the post-World War II international order. He is testing to see what he can get away with, and so far, he has discovered that he can get away with almost anything. The kidnapping of Maduro, the seizure of Venezuelan oil, the threatened annexation of Greenland, the economic warfare against allies, all of these should have triggered massive international resistance and collective action to punish the United States and deter further aggression. Instead, the response has been weak protests, hand-wringing, and ultimately capitulation. This emboldens Trump to go further, to take more risks, to make even more outrageous demands, because he has learned that there are no consequences for his actions. What comes next is genuinely unpredictable because Trump operates without any strategic framework or long-term plan. He is impulsive, reactive, and driven by ego and the desire for immediate gratification. Tomorrow he might decide that he wants Scotland, or Norway, or a piece of Canada. He might wake up and decide that some historical grievance needs to be addressed, and that America deserves compensation in the form of territory or resources. There is no logic to Trump's demands other than the logic of power and the belief that might makes right. This makes him extraordinarily dangerous because predictability is essential for stability in international relations. When countries can anticipate how other countries will behave, they can plan accordingly, build deterrence, and avoid accidental escalation. When a major power is led by someone who is fundamentally unpredictable and unconstrained by any institutional checks, the risk of miscalculation and catastrophic conflict increases exponentially. Trump is not creating a new world order. He is demolishing the old order without any vision for what should replace it. The institutions he is destroying, the United Nations, NATO, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, all of these were created by the United States after World War II to serve American interests while providing enough benefits to other countries that they would voluntarily participate in an American-led system. This was enlightened self-interest, the recognition that American prosperity and security were best served by a stable international order governed by predictable rules that applied to everyone. Trump rejects this framework entirely. He sees international institutions as constraints on American power rather than force multipliers. He believes that America is strong enough to dominate the world through unilateral action, and that cooperation with other countries is unnecessary and often counterproductive because it requires compromise and limits American freedom of action. The problem with Trump's approach is that it destroys the foundations of American power while appearing to enhance it. Yes, America has the most powerful military on earth and the ability to seize resources from weaker countries by force. But American power has never been based solely on military might. It has been based on alliances, on the dollar's role as the global reserve currency, on the attractiveness of American culture and values, on the perception that America is a force for stability and prosperity in the world. Trump is systematically destroying all of these sources of power. Allies are hedging and looking for alternatives to dependence on the United States. Countries are exploring ways to reduce their reliance on the dollar for international trade and reserve holdings. American culture and values are no longer seen as aspirational when America is led by someone who openly embraces authoritarianism and imperialism. And the perception that America promotes stability is being replaced by the reality that America is the primary source of global instability and chaos. In the long run, this will weaken America even as it creates the illusion of strength in the short run. Seizing Venezuelan oil might make America more energy independent and enrich American oil companies, but it will also teach every other oil-producing nation that they need to diversify their customers and reduce their exposure to American pressure. Threatening allies with economic warfare might force short-term concessions, but it will also accelerate European efforts to build independent military capabilities and reduce economic dependence on the United States. Withdrawing from international institutions might free America from certain obligations and constraints, but it will also eliminate American influence over how those institutions operate and create space for China and Russia to shape global governance in ways that serve their interests rather than American interests. Trump is trading long-term American hegemony for short-term tactical gains, and he does not seem to understand or care about the difference. He is a businessman who thinks in terms of quarterly profits rather than generational investments. He sees a deal where America can extract immediate benefits and takes it without considering the long-term costs and consequences. This is why virtually every serious foreign policy expert, regardless of political affiliation, is terrified of what Trump is doing. They can see the damage he is causing to American credibility, American alliances, and American influence, and they understand that this damage will take decades to repair if it can be repaired at all. The world is adjusting to the reality of American unreliability and aggression. Canada, a country that has been America's closest ally and most reliable trading partner for over a century, is now hedging against the United States by improving relations with China. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney visited Beijing and worked to normalize relations with a country that Canada had been at odds with for years, all because Canada can no longer count on the United States to be a reliable partner. This is a massive shift in Canadian foreign policy, driven entirely by the recognition that Trump represents an existential threat to Canadian sovereignty and economic security. Carney's comments at Davos were among the most honest and revealing statements any Western leader has made about the current state of international relations. He admitted that the rules-based international order was always somewhat of a fiction, that international law was applied selectively depending on who was breaking it, and that the system worked primarily because American hegemony made it beneficial for other countries to pretend that the rules were real and meaningful. Now that America is abandoning even the pretense of respecting international law, Carney said, the fiction can no longer be maintained. Canada is facing reality as it actually exists rather than as Canada would like it to be. Carney described what is happening not as a transition but as a rupture, a complete break with the past that cannot be managed or smoothed over through incremental adjustments. This is a crucial distinction. A transition implies continuity, the sense that we are moving from one system to another in a relatively orderly way. A rupture implies a violent break, a fundamental discontinuity where the old rules no longer apply and the new rules have not yet been established. We are in a period of radical uncertainty where anything is possible and nothing can be taken for granted. Carney's warning that countries must adapt or be consumed, that those who are not at the table will end up on the menu, is chilling because it comes from the leader of a G7 nation, one of the wealthiest and most secure countries on Earth. If Canada feels threatened and vulnerable, imagine how smaller and weaker countries must feel. Carney also acknowledged that Canada and other middle powers made a devil's bargain with the United States during the era of American hegemony. They supported an international order that was fundamentally unjust and hypocritical because it served their economic interests and provided them with security guarantees. They participated in the rituals of international diplomacy, paid lip service to international law, and pretended that the system was fair even though everyone knew it was not. This bargain is no longer working because America is now treating its allies the way it previously treated its enemies, with coercion, threats, and demands for submission. Carney said that when integration becomes the source of your vulnerability rather than your strength, you cannot continue to live the lie of mutual benefit through integration. In other words, when the economic and military ties that were supposed to make Canada secure are instead being weaponized against Canada, those ties need to be severed or radically rethought. This is an extraordinary admission from a Western leader. a recognition that the entire framework of transatlantic cooperation and liberal internationalism was built on a foundation of hypocrisy and self-interest rather than genuine commitment to universal values. Carney deserves credit for his honesty, but his honesty also reveals the moral bankruptcy of the system that Canada and other Western nations supported for so long. If the rules-based order was always a convenient fiction, if international law was always applied selectively to benefit the powerful, then what exactly were Western nations defending during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War era? The answer seems to be that they were defending their own privileges and prosperity, not any higher principle. And now that America is pulling the rug out from under its allies, those allies are scrambling to adapt to a world where power is all that matters and cooperation is a sign of weakness. Carney said that middle powers need to band together to resist the aggression of great powers, that if they are not at the table, they will be on the menu. This is sound strategic advice, but it also represents a fundamental shift in how countries like Canada see their place in the world. Canada is no longer comfortable being a junior partner in an American-led alliance. Canada is looking to build coalitions with other middle powers to balance against not just Russia and China, but also the United States. This is a direct consequence of Trump's actions and rhetoric, the recognition that America can no longer be trusted and may in fact be the primary threat to Canadian sovereignty and security. The same dynamics are playing out across Europe. France and Germany are discussing European strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe needs to be able to defend itself and pursue its own foreign policy objectives without depending on American support or acquiescence. This has been a talking point for years, but it is now becoming an urgent priority because European leaders understand that Trump is serious about abandoning Europe or even turning against it. The European Union is investing heavily in defense industries, expanding military forces, and developing capabilities that would allow Europe to operate independently of the United States. This is a massive undertaking that will require decades and trillions of euros, but there is no alternative if Europe wants to survive in a world where America is hostile or indifferent to European security. Russia and China are watching these developments with great interest and some satisfaction. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that the rules-based international order is over and that we are entering an era where only power matters. This is music to Moscow's ears because Russia has been arguing for years that international law is hypocritical and selective, applied by the West against its enemies but ignored when Western interests are at stake. Trump is proving Lavrov right, and in doing so, he is vindicating Russia's decision to invade Ukraine and challenge the post-Cold War European security order. If America is kidnapping heads of state and seizing territory from allies, then Russia's invasion of Ukraine looks comparatively restrained and justified. This is the propaganda victory that Russia has been seeking for years, and Trump is handing it to them on a silver platter. Lavrov also warned that Europe is preparing for war with Russia, that European leaders still harbor ambitions to inflict a strategic defeat on Moscow, and that Russia must prepare accordingly. This is not just rhetoric. Both sides are arming, both sides are preparing for conflict, and both sides see the other as an existential threat. This is exactly how great power wars start, through mutual fear and the belief that war is inevitable, and therefore it is better to strike first or prepare so thoroughly that the other side will not dare to attack. The collapse of NATO and the fraying of the transatlantic alliance make war between Russia and Europe more likely, not less, because the deterrent effect of American military power is being removed even as European and Russian tensions increase. China is also benefiting from Trump's destruction of the American-led order. Chinese officials are warning about a return to the law of the jungle while simultaneously positioning China as the defender of international cooperation and multilateralism. This is rich given China's own violations of international law in the South China Sea, its treatment of Taiwan, and its authoritarian domestic policies, but it is effective propaganda because Trump is making it easy for China to claim the moral high ground. Chinese Vice Premier H. Leng said at Davos that the world should not return to jungle law, that no country should have special privileges based solely on its power, and that international relations should be based on mutual benefit rather than domination. These are exactly the talking points that the United States used to make when it was building the post-World War II order, and now China is making them while America embraces naked imperialism. The irony is almost too much to bear, but it is also strategically significant. China is positioning itself as the responsible stakeholder in the international system, the power that respects sovereignty, promotes economic cooperation, and opposes unilateral aggression. This is a complete reversal of roles, with America playing the part of the revisionist aggressor and China playing the part of the status quo defender. This shift in perception will have real consequences for how other countries align themselves and who they see as the greater threat to their security and prosperity. If the choice is between an America that kidnaps presidents and seizes territory and a China that offers investment and infrastructure development, many countries will choose China even if they have reservations about Chinese authoritarian governance. Every major power and virtually every world leader is saying the same thing. The world has changed, the old order is dead, and we are entering an era of great power competition where might makes right and institutions provide no protection. This is not speculation or alarmism. This is the sober assessment of political leaders who have access to the best intelligence and the most sophisticated strategic analysis available. They are telling us that we are living through a rupture, a fundamental break with the past, and that the future will be defined by conflict, instability, and the ruthless pursuit of power. We predicted this. We said years ago that the international order was fragmenting, that American leadership was becoming more erratic and unreliable, and that the world was moving toward a more dangerous and chaotic era. We were accused of being pessimistic, of fear-mongering, of exaggerating the risks. But now the leaders of Canada, France, Russia, and China are saying exactly what we said, and they are saying it because they have no choice but to acknowledge the reality that is unfolding in front of them. We wish we had been wrong. We wish that our predictions had been too dark and that the world had found a way to maintain stability and cooperation. But the indicators were clear. The trajectory was obvious. And now the consequences are beginning to manifest in ways that are undeniable and terrifying. What happens next will determine the course of history for the rest of this century and beyond. If Trump continues on his current path, if he invades Iran, if he seizes more territory, if he continues to dismantle international institutions and threaten allies, then we are headed toward a world of constant conflict and instability. The parallels to the 1930s are not exact, but they are close enough to be deeply concerning. In the 1930s, the League of Nations collapsed because major powers refused to respect it, and the result was the most destructive war in human history. Today, the United Nations is collapsing because the United States is withdrawing its support and violating its principles, and the risk of another catastrophic war is growing by the day. The next 3 years will be extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Trump shows no signs of moderating his behavior or returning to any semblance of normal foreign policy. He is surrounded by people who either share his extreme views or are too afraid to oppose him. The institutions that could constrain him, Congress, the courts, the bureaucracy, have all been weakened or captured by loyalists, and the international community is too divided and too weak to mount an effective resistance. We are essentially at the mercy of Trump's impulses and decisions, hoping that he will not do something catastrophic, but having no way to prevent him if he chooses to. The most important thing to understand is that this is not a temporary crisis that will end when Trump leaves office. The damage he is doing is permanent. The precedents he is setting will be cited by future leaders to justify their own aggressive actions. The institutions he is destroying will not be rebuilt in their previous form. The alliances he is breaking will not be fully restored. The trust he is squandering will not be recovered. America will be a different country when Trump is gone, and the world will be a different place more dangerous, more fragmented, and more prone to conflict. We are entering a dark age of international relations, and there is no clear path back to the light. The best we can hope for is to navigate this period with our eyes open, understanding the risks, preparing for the worst, and holding on to whatever principles and values we can preserve in a world that increasingly rejects both. This is the reality we face, and we must face it without illusions, without false hope, and with the grim determination to survive whatever comes next.